a lot of different groups came to this understanding and they just said, oh, the place to go must be Mexico. And there is a lot of opportunity in Mexico, but very similar to Vietnam, it's a much smaller manufacturing marketplace. What's interesting is that because of the size of the Indian marketplace, because of the raw materials that are going on there, that now is starting to allow for the consumer products market to start to flourish in that area.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at the independent ERP and digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. Which country would you think would be the most strategic for your supply chain? Which country would be the most strategic for an apparel business? Do different components such as zippers versus textile needs to be sourced from different countries? How do different regions of India provide different textile materials such as performance fabric versus organic? How would this all help in creating a robust supply chain? In today's episode, our guest, Anantveer and Ben, shares his insights into how to create a robust supply chain for an apparel business. They also discussed the challenges with global supply chain due to the macroeconomic conditions, war, and inflation. Finally, they discussed several other concepts impacting apparel industry, such as different regions for sourcing, marketplaces, and logistics challenges. Let me introduce Ben and Anant to you. Benjamin Hopwo is currently the Chief Operating Officer for Gemba, along with Anantveer Agarwal, who is the Director of Production Central Asia. Both of them bring a profound understanding of global supply chain, especially for the apparel market. They also bring deep expertise of different regions of India and why Indian market is strategic for apparel industry and manufacturing due to the changing landscape of supply chain, macroeconomic conditions, and regulatory policies. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey guys, welcome to the show.
Hey Sam, happy to be
Thanks
here.
so much.
Hey guys, I am super excited to have you as well, especially the kind of insights that you are going to bring for the apparel market. And India is always a very strategic market as far as the apparel industry goes. So, and with the current market conditions, our listeners are going to be so interested in knowing what's going on there. So we are going to have a lot of fun discussing all of that. Before we do that, just to get things off, do you guys want to start with your personal story and current focus? Ben, I'll start with you.
Certainly. Well, it's great to get to meet everybody today. So my background was in 2002, I ended up heading over to China and was in the Asia region. So this would be China, Southeast Asia, and a little bit in Southern Asia for about 17 years, doing manufacturing and supply chain out there. Worked for organizations as large as, Walmart and Caterpillar and some of those groups, as well as small to medium-sized businesses. But almost everything that I did during that period of time was really focused on what does it take to set up a really, really robust supply chain, and then really seeing how the change that was happening over that 10-year period to 15-year period really was moving markets, not just from the U.S. to overseas, but then from country to country. And of course, over the past 4 years, we've only seen that acceleration grow. Currently, I'm the COO at Gemba, and we are a marketplace for product development. So we handle everything from design all the way through manufacturing and fulfillment. So we have quite an extensive manufacturing network as well as an expert network that helps us to attain that.
Okay, amazing background there. And by the way, robust supply chain, I don't know supply chains are ever going to be robust, but we'll probably figure out the formula today how to make them robust. On that note, I am actually going to start with Anantveer. Do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus as well?
Absolutely. So on my side, Sam, I've been, I think most of my career, I've been an entrepreneur. I started my own businesses back, I think 15 years ago was my first business, where I set
Very
up a
cool.
textile exports company. To this day, that company runs. We are still manufacturers of multiple different types of apparels in India, and it is currently being headed by someone else from my family. But essentially, being an entrepreneur has always been my background. That has been one of the businesses that I've been a part of. And additionally, in terms of manufacturing, I've mostly been focusing on the agricultural space. So I have been running a tea manufacturing business. So actually, that's also a bit of my family background there, where I've been involved in setting up multiple different types of plantation crops
Very
for
cool.
processing of tea, making sure that the quality of tea that we produce over the years is sees constant improvement, making sure that adequate amount of technology is added from year to year to ensure that we're keeping up with that space. So basically, manufacturing has been the core of my background, and with entrepreneurship involved, I've always been interested in setting up businesses, and now at Gemba, being the director of production at Central Asia, I'm helping other people's businesses set up different supply chains. That's been very exciting for me in terms of my journey.
Very cool. And in general, in lifetime, most people may have, let's say, 40 to 60 years of experience. When you have the family background in something, you are probably going to have 60 to 80. So you have an edge there, great background there. On that note, we have one more standard question that we ask every single guest. And after that, we are going to be digging into how to set up this market. So that standard question is going to be your perspective on business growth. Ben, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'd start by first turning the question on its head, which looks at I think that oftentimes in businesses, when you look at large corporations, you see this really clearly, but you also see it in small business, is that there's somewhat of a tick-tock type of setup when you start talking about organizations that over about a 5 to 10 year period, they oftentimes switch from growth to then they then start to focus on internal operations, efficiencies, these types of things. And we're really at this fascinating inflection point right now with the economy and with organizations where if we were to look at the past 5 years, a lot of organizations, especially within our space, were very, very much focused on growth. So it was all about how do we get funding together so that we can purchase other companies, so that we can bring on more brands, these types of things. And now recently, what we've been seeing a hard pivot, and that hard pivot is starting to go towards what does operational efficiency look like? What does it mean to make sure that you're really profitable as an organization, so that you can really focus on the fundamentals of your business model? And so while it's not you can call it growth, it still will grow, but it's a different way of growing. And it's not just growth for like revenue growth's sake, but really looking and saying, okay, here's another aspect of our business that we need to focus on. And so when we look at supply chains, there's been all sorts of shock that's been going through the system. And you referred to that when we kind of smiled when you said robust. Because really, we had been seeing, higher costs that have been going into labor that have been going on for the past 15 years. As an example, in China, we ended up having almost a 20x growth in terms of in labor costs over time. But then when tariffs ended up hitting, and then finally over the past 2 to 3 years, when the logistics shock went through the system, we're now seeing people taking a really, really hard look at it and saying, what does it mean to potentially move our supply chain? What needs to continue happening there? But the challenge is that when you end up moving supply chains, you can actually create additional dependencies in that. And so when you're trying to say, okay, now how do we get this? Do we stay with our current suppliers? And do we just really, really kind of focus, white knuckling it, to getting costs out of the system, or do you have to change the paradigm? And today, right now, Gemba is seeing a lot of organizations saying we really need to start exploring how we change the paradigm so that we can achieve higher efficiencies, so that we can continue to do product development, but doing it at a rate that's sustainable organizationally that can lead to high profit.
So amazing. By the way, you did turn the question on its head. So I really liked it. And by the way, you used the word inflection point. Inflection point is so critical in general in terms of the growth journey. And I believe you mentioned the hard pivot and soft pivot. I think both are going to be equally critical. Sometimes you are going to be making hard pivots, but soft pivots are going to be equally critical as well as you are going to inflection points. On that note, Anantveer, I'm actually coming to you. So what is your perspective on growth? Would you like to add anything? Would you like to reinforce anything? What's your perspective?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with what Benjamin referred to, and what we are seeing today at Gemba. My idea of growth essentially is basically making sure that you're as an organization, you're always pushing boundaries, and you're always taking the difficult road ahead, which ensures that you're always sort of pushing the limits for your organization, something that you've not done before in terms of, even if you're talking about just simple sourcing. If you've been used to sourcing from a particular region all throughout your life, you must sort of break that barrier, and you must explore in terms of what other opportunities you may have to be able to make the right decisions moving forward for your organization. So that constant effort to break the boundaries is what translates into growth for me. So as long as you're doing that as an organization and making sure that you're exploring each and every opportunity out there, and you're taking a decision based off of that, that is what growth is for me.
Yeah, could not agree more. Unless you explore, how would you know what else is out there? So I completely agree. And in fact, I mean, when you are trying to this robust supply chain, obviously you need as many modes of sourcing, as many sources of sourcing. I don't know if that is a term, but I'll use that, on this episode. Okay. So we are going to dig deeper into overall the apparel market. And you mentioned about the marketplace, and we have collaborated with a lot of different markets so far on this podcast. And I don't know if you guys consider them as competitor. Used to be very focused on a specific market segment. So Fictive, Code Beam, these are all marketplaces that we have collaborated with. They seem to be focused more on the manufacturing, engineering centric operations, but you guys seem to be focusing, I believe, on the apparel. You guys can probably add more colors there in terms of your focus. But when you are looking at this whole notion of supply chain, especially for the apparel market, and when I talk to any of the executives or the supply chain executives, they all talk about how India is important. So obviously India is going to be there. I don't know how the global market is structured, if there are going to be any other sources other than India that could be potentially part of the supply chain. So maybe give us the macro view of the supply chain, Ben, when it comes to setting up this whole idea of robust supply chain for the apparel market. Ben, do you want to start?
Certainly. Yeah, and I can just start by just saying Gemba is involved in a lot of different types of product development. So we have over 1,500 manufacturers in multiple different hard goods, soft goods, electronic categories. So whether you're talking about pet products, or you're talking about baby products, or you're talking about sports and outdoors, these are all areas that our network is very familiar with. That said, I think that and Anantveer can speak a little bit more to some of the real strengths that we're seeing in India. I think that starting at what is the problem set is really an appropriate place to start here. And the problem set that we see is that for organizations, especially smaller organizations, so the expansion of groups like Amazon and Shopify and others, in combination with Chinese manufacturing, allowed for many small organizations to get started. Now, that's not to say that it was only happening in China, but the OEM opportunities for small brands to begin going and exploring and saying, hey, I'd like to get into mugs. And if you're going to do mugs, you're going to do coffee cups, like, what can I purchase here? And it was easy for them to find those manufacturers and then to say, okay, I'd like this design or that design, or I'd like to make these types of changes. However, more recently, we've started to see a larger shift where people are starting to explore and say, well, we're quite happy with the manufacturing that we have going on. What does this look like in a new marketplace? And specifically for products that have significant amounts of labor cost in it, where should we head? Where do we need to go? And one of the places that we've seen a lot of success is actually in the India market. And really, it's interesting because again, if we were to back up to last year, a lot of different groups came to this understanding, and they just said, "Oh, the place to go must be Mexico." And there is a lot of opportunity in Mexico, but very similar to Vietnam, it's a much smaller manufacturing marketplace. So we ended up seeing saturation that happened quite rapidly in that place, and it still today is going on today with lots of different brands trying to get over there. What's interesting is that because of the size of the Indian marketplace, because of the raw materials that are going on there, we've actually seen a lot of opportunity where India has been investing in things like mills and in the raw metals and these types of metallurgy types of areas that now is starting to allow for the consumer products market to start to flourish in that area. And so because of that, a lot of groups, when they end up trying to shift to a North or even a Central or South America strategy, is that they're still pulling a lot of technical fabrics or extruded aluminum or pieces like that from the Asia marketplace, the East Asia marketplace. Whereas India is actually a large enough manufacturer now today and is still growing that these products are actually available internally within the country. And that's not to say that everything is there, right? Anantveer will talk specifically about things like zippers and other accessories that are still found primarily in East Asia. But we're seeing this groundswell that's happening, and as more and more moves to that area, we're going to start to see more and more options available. But I'll go ahead and pass it over to Anantveer to talk a little bit more deeply about this in the India marketplace.
Sure. So, Sam, I can give you some insight into the apparel space currently in India, especially the export space. So the factories in India, you can say India is not, it's different from China in this way, where the manufacturing industry is wide. It's spread geographically to all parts of India. So, for instance, if you look at the textile space, the southern part of India is supposed to be the textile capital of India, which is also known as a place called Tirupur. Now, in Tirupur, you will only find specialized type of textiles. For instance, cotton. Any types of organic textiles primarily is what dominates the area. So if you talk about cotton, if you talk about organic alternative materials nowadays, that is one space that India is excelling at, is developing different types and different varieties of organic cotton. Then you have things like hemp. Hemp is growing very widely in India at this point. It's cultivated in India now, and it's also being converted into different types of fabrics for the home and decor industry, for clothing, for all different types of applications. So in terms of the alternative textile space, I think India is beginning to shine. Of course, it has a long way to go, but I think it gives a good competition to any of the other existing textile exporting countries. But if you talk about cotton specifically, southern part of India dominates the export market there. Then we have in the western part of India, we have factories that are primarily focused on nylon, on polyester, all types of man-made fabrics, something what you call technical textiles nowadays. So technical textiles, in other words, is anything that is developed, or the utility of it is what is more important. The functionality of it is more important than the aesthetic appeal or the decoration usage of the fabric. So the western part of India is primarily focused on developing those kind of technical textiles, which has multiple different types of PVC coated fabrics and things that that are used for outdoor and camping sort of products. Those fall into the technical textiles. Now, in this space, I would agree that India is still growing as a nation. It needs more investment, more research and development. The PVC is generally dominated by China. So most of the coatings and all of these things are still imported from China and are traded locally in India. So I would say we are still slightly behind China in that aspect, but we need more investment into this type of technology that develops different types of PVC coatings, DWR coatings, and multiple other different types of functionally benefiting materials that are applied onto fabric. In the northern part of India, we have Ludhiana and Amritsar and these type of places where there's a lot of hand weaving, and weaving is predominant in that region. So we have from your woolens to your all types of winter wear and outdoor sports and winter wear categories come out of pashmina shawls, and all of those items come out from the northern part of India. So every part of India is distinct in terms of their specialties. So if you want a woolen product, you will not go to the south of India. You will definitely go to North India to find suitable factories. So that's how geographically it is spread out in India. And in terms of product development, I would say at this point, India is positioned. I would say India is, at this time, especially with if you must have heard recently, there are restrictions on import of cotton material from specific regions in China. So that's just an example of what is driving more and more growth, or more and more clients of ours towards India, is for a more sustainable, long-term, sustainable future. And specifically because India is growing to be stronger in the textile space with their technology, with their garmenting, with their skilled labor that is focused on creating better quality products in the textile space. I think more and more that's one main reason for our clients to be making the shift to India. Of course, there are other reasons as well. For example, India is the second largest English speaking nation in the world. So communication makes it very easy for our clients to come to India. Of course, there are multiple other reasons. For instance, the factories have started to become extremely supportive of any new type of product development for our clients. They've been very focused on providing that extra level of service to our clients. For they realize the potential of lower MOQs in the beginning, and making multi-million dollar business partnerships out of that. So these are little things that I believe Indian manufacturers have started to pay attention to, that is now helping them get more and more business, helping them grow their export networks. And of course, like Benjamin mentioned, there are always going to be certain items that are predominantly being manufactured in China. For instance, like I mentioned, from PVC coatings to zippers to velcros. There are many different types of high quality velcros that have multiple different types of applications within textiles. But I think India needs to invest heavily on the manufacturing of these type of trims and accessory related items to be able to be completely independent of imports of these accessories from different nations in East Asia.
Okay, some very interesting layers there. First off, when you provide the great breakdown and comparison overall between your South American versus sort of the Asian market, and then Anant, you provided great geographic breakdown of how each of the materials are going to be, or regions are going to be, with specific textile fabric. So, but there are some layers there that I want to touch at a deeper. So again, going back to our notion of this whole robust supply chain, and when anybody is planning for supply chain, there are going to be many different aspects. It's not going to be just the material that is going to be available in a specific region. For example, when you had mentioned the dependency, and dependency is going to be, for example, the zippers. You both mentioned the example about that in the case of zipper, you are still going to be dependent upon that region. And I think aluminum extrusion is another example that you guys mentioned, that you are going to be dependent upon that. So this is going to be your dependent material that you need to go to those regions. And if one region can provide everything, then obviously your supply chain is probably going to be robust. But when we look at the supply chain is going to have a lot of layers. Number one is going to be your transportation. So when you are comparing your South America versus your Asia region, my understanding is going to be overall transportation is expensive as well as difficult. And I don't know if when you are looking at India, so India, when you mentioned north versus south, and I don't know if there are going to be any sort of layers there which are going to be far more accessible from the transportation, from the supply chain, from the container perspective. So that's another layer. The third layer that I would like to add here is going to be my favorite, which is going to be taxation. And if you look at countries like Mexico as well as India, And I don't know if there are any other countries. They are going through humongous transformation at this point of time overall in their taxation structure. And the whole taxation piece has increased significantly. The way they tax, the admin effort is going to be higher. So obviously your manufacturing, the supply chain cost is going to be higher. And then, your own cost is going to be higher, let's say if you're running operations. So I'll throw all of that out there. I don't know if you guys are going to add anything, Ben. I'll start with you. What do you think when you are, let's say if I'm the CFO and I'm thinking about supply chain for my apparel business, I need to think about all of these layers. So what would you add to that, Ben?
Sure. So I think that, if you put your CFO hat on, one of the important areas that wasn't mentioned, but I think is a really important one, is to think about what your stock levels are.
Yep.
So, when you talk about your overall cash flows, when you're coming from a place like East Asia or Southern Asia, like in India, when you start looking at the terms that you're going to get, this is going to be incredibly important. And there's a number of tools that can be used for that, to cover that, such that you can get 90-day terms from different organizations, even for small to medium-sized businesses. And we could talk about that a little bit later if that was interesting to your listeners. But I think that the reason why I mention this is because when we see, like, for instance, like a Mexico or even a South America strategy that goes into place, oftentimes, and this goes into your second layer of logistics, is that you're going to find some surprising things, and they may surprise to the negative. As an example, I just recently saw, so this was about 4 weeks ago, when gas prices were relatively high in the U.S., we ended up seeing a 50-plus foot dry van cost from Mexico City, the Mexico City area. So, we're not talking about southern Mexico here. We're talking about kind of central southern Mexico region. And it was coming in to get it over the line into the U.S. at roughly $6,000 to $7,000. Now, for your listeners who are familiar with where container prices are today, like, container prices now from an East Asia standpoint have now started to float below $7,000 in the $6,500 range. So part of it is that things that you might assume, which is that just because we went through this logistic shock piece, you still getting it over land, while it may be more likely you may not have like an outage in the same way that we were having from East Asia or even Southern Asia, that your logistics costs may be still quite high. And so it's really, really important that you take into account, what is your overall inventory levels? If you can significantly reduce your inventory levels, that's really, really important. So a strategy that we talked about with a group recently was where, when they look at East or Southern Asia, they actually still have all of their high runners still coming out of that area, but they have maybe, say, 3 SKUs. They then use that to stock to put in stock rooms or on retail floors with the high runners, because they know that they're going to be selling through quite a lot of it. But then they end up setting up closer, nearer to shore, a lot of their stock inventory SKUs that don't have as high a volume. And then that way they don't have like inventory hanging out in their warehouse, which is a real problem for a lot of groups today. But specifically looking at the India side, and I can let Anantveer talk a little bit about the taxation piece. We are seeing that, like, for instance, there's a different strategy. So whereas many clients who may have been going out of East Asia, they were going into the West Coast. Instead, we actually recommend that our clients really look at the East Coast, which then, at least on the US side and or a Europe strategy, that then allows for them to create new partnerships with groups that are potentially not as busy as West Coast facilities may have been. And so it starts to allow you to address both sides of the US as in a more holistic way. And the final thing I'll just say is that I think for almost all groups, really looking at where is your bill of material coming from is incredibly important right now. Yeah. And the reason for it, just like we said, is that for lack of a zipper, you could have, your manufacturing shut down. And so this is where we're figuring out, it's not that it doesn't exist in other markets, it's oftentimes more expensive. And so if you only have kind of your blinders on that say we need to absolutely be lowest cost, then that can actually get you into a place to where then if that market gets cut off or there's some sort of interruption that happens, then you're stuck going to a new manufacturer and you're starting from scratch. As opposed to saying, hey, we might get 50 to 70% out of our low cost region, and we're going to get 30 to 50% out of our higher cost region. But it ends up becoming something that that you can then scale up that other region if necessary, because a small amount of additional cost is generally speaking a lot better than having a full outage of the entire product.
Okay, so great advice. Do not have your blinders on. So I don't know if you're going to have any thing to add there overall based on what Ben mentioned.
So, Sam, I would love to add something to what Ben just said. So, in terms of the shipping costs, I'll give you a brief insight into this. So, pre-COVID levels, pre-COVID, the shipping from India to the US, and I'm talking about the west coast of US, was roughly around $5,000 to $6,000 a container. Right, during COVID, or let's say even till July 2021, we saw levels go up to $19,000 or $20,000. Now, in 2 years down the line, we are back at the 13,000, 14,000 levels at a 30% reduction already. So you can see the fluctuation that's happening in the span of 3 years here. By next year, we are anticipating the cost to go down to around 7,000 and 8,000 levels, which is basically the pre-COVID levels. So again, shipping costs at this point are, of course, off the roof. I would agree, but we are very hopeful for some sort of regulation in this space and some sort of cost reductions in the next year to come. And we're really hoping that trade goes back to the pre-COVID levels. And shipping costs have honestly affected multiple different types of business. But having said that, I would also like to add that it's very important for each business owner to assess the landed costs to their facility at all times. Now, I know we talk about shipping costs all the time, about it going off the roof, and pricing of a particular component of your product being a little expensive. But what is the overall cost you're paying for that particular product? That is something that business owners must have visibility towards. They must always calculate in terms of whenever there is a price fluctuation, they should always keep the delivered duty paid, or in other words, the landed costs in mind, to be able to have an apples to apples comparison of whether there was an opportunity cost of importing that same material from another country in another part of the world, and whether they would have saved cost doing that. So in other words, the same material that is imported from India and the same material that is imported from China will have different costs, even though the shipping cost from China might be lower than that of India, even if the FOB prices are the same. So even if there is one factor in the entire mix that is different, that could affect the landed cost. And I feel like it's very important for us to pay attention to the cost.
Yeah, could not agree more. Some great additions there overall in terms of the logistics. And sometimes we just feel and assume that one region is probably going to be cheaper, but that may not be true. So one of the things that I am noticing in this conversation is the magic of zippers, I guess. So I don't know why they are so critical and what is so difficult in producing them. So do you guys want to touch a little bit about, is that the most critical component that you can have in your apparel process, or there are going to be others? So maybe talk about that. What is complex about the manufacturing process? Which are the regions that are serving the zippers, and how companies should be planning around them if they are going to be apparel companies? Ben, do you want to start first?
Sure. Yeah. So one I would say is that Anantveer touched on this before, which is like oftentimes you'll go and you'll get a quote from a manufacturer, and that manufacturer will come back and it's like, boom, there it is. And there can be a little bit of shock, at least initially, when organizations are first dealing with a new region, where it's like, wow, why is this so expensive? Which can then lead to a dismissal. And what we would say is that like you've really got to kind of put your pioneering hat on.
Yeah.
Like when I think back to 2002, the very first SARS outbreak in China or those types of places, it's interesting because I hear very similar, people who say, oh, well, it's so easy in a certain region versus other regions. That happens almost every time you're going into a new region. And so in that, I think it's important to talk about like what can you do to really get down to like the nuts and bolts of what it takes to actually make the move. You had mentioned zippers. So like as an example, when we look at zippers or we look at, say locks
Yeah.
or small accessories along those lines, one is that volume is super important here. It's an area for those that are in manufacturing. It's like, yeah, you drive the raw material costs down, you start to bring in raw material costs. Part of it is that when organizations and governments subsidize raw materials, and then they end up having that raw material processing going on, that then also further depresses the price. But then from there, it goes into automation. So, what type of machinery is being used to actually produce this? So, automation versus low cost labor, generally speaking, automation is likely going to win on that side, especially when you talk about, we're not talking about cutting edge automation. What I'm talking about is stuff that like, it's like we're going to make this zipper and like you're not going to have people, hand pressing zippers. If you do, like you're going to have problems. And so in that, having the automation that is sustained by the actual volume of production that's going on. And I fully believe, as an example, in India or in other regions, that as we see volume start to move, of course, we're going to start to see smaller players. Those smaller players are going to grow to become medium-sized to larger players in these markets, and it will become available. Just like the overall moves that are happening, it's just going to take a little bit of time on that piece of it. But the secondary portion of this is that you really need to look in your bill of materials to determine what are your real price drivers. And a lot of times what we see in the soft goods and in the apparel market, it's not necessarily going to be your zippers or even your Velcro that's going to be driving that cost. It's going to be your fabric. Generally speaking, your cut and sew, if you can find some great cut and sews in India that are already automating in significant ways. So they have both low cost labor as well as automation happening at the same time, which makes for a great mix. But then what you end up finding is that the technical fabrics, okay, these types of sports types of fabrics or otherwise, like they're just not as available. And so, but the great thing about India is that we now have a number of mills that are actually in India that are now willing to do the R&D and the work necessary to get you to the place that you need to go. I'll give two examples, and Anantveer can dive into one of them if you'd like. But in one case, we ended up working with an organization that was a very large bag manufacturer. And when I say, like tens of containers per day going out in the bag space. But in order for them to make the move from East Asia to Southern Asia, it really required that they work with the groups to create a new polyester, a lower cost polyester that could be done in India. Once that was achieved, that then opened up a whole new business line for multiple different groups. And the manufacturers were really the ones that then worked with the mills and with the other groups to make it happen. In the second example, we had another group that was doing what would be kind of a sports type of a performance wear type of fabric. And again, finding the manufacturer that was large enough and integrative enough to be able to work with the mills directly ended up resulting in a really high quality fabric that was at a cost point that was really attractive. And so then when you pair it up with low cost cut and sew, it made for a huge win for them as an organization. But Anantveer, I don't know if you'd like to jump into one of those two as we look at like what's actually driving the cost and how do organizations, how do they solve for this?
Right. So I just wanted to add that, so polyester, you mentioned, Benjamin. India has primarily been focused all of these years, in the past few decades, on organic material. So when we talk about organic wool, cotton, bamboo, all of these different types of natural fibers, that has been the primary focus in India. But when we talk about polyester, nowadays we see a ton of factories in India investing in polyester yarn technology that's recyclable polyester. So primarily the focus has been towards recycling and producing low cost polyester that is specifically for the South Asian market and not the higher costing or high quality markets like the EU and the US. So that market was primarily dominated by China, who was making, due to their technologies and due to their investments in manufacturing very high quality polyesters from which performance fabrics are prepared, which is primarily used in the sports industry. China was primarily focused on that portion of it all of these years. That is pretty much why we see that importing these high performance yarns or fabrics from another countries, specifically China, drives the cost up. That is the most important factor here to consider. And when we talk about the Indian mills jumping into the space, we've seen. So, for instance, in India, I don't know if some of the listeners have heard about this group, but the market is dominated by this group called Reliance Corporation in India. Reliance is the primary manufacturer of polyester yarn in India, and it dominates the oil space as well. So all of the developments in this space has been pretty much driven by this company that has dominated the imports of all of the yarn and all of the other raw materials to manufacture this yarn. So these have been certain blockers in making sure that there's more investment in this space, that there is more mills ready to develop such high performance fabrics, and that is why primarily due to all of these reasons, the costs haven't been significantly brought down over the years. However, now that we are seeing more and more shift towards India as a manufacturing space, we're seeing mills invest more time, more money in getting the right machinery set up to actually develop the yarn from the fiber level, and they're working on different types of R&D to create such high performance fabrics, Indian based yarns that can give competition to some of the best functional yarns around the world. So we are starting to see that shift already. And in the years to come, we'll see very competitive raw materials coming out of India.
Okay, so some very interesting layers there. And by the way, Ben, the way you started, I think you are going to make my designers so unhappy because you are trying to imply that, you should be mass produced. And they are going to feel that, why do you need those ugly zippers on those apparels? So, okay, so we'll figure out, okay, how to make the zippers sexy. At the same time, you need to make sure that your supply chain is going to be robust as well. So the other layer that I want to touch is going to be the outbreak that you mentioned. I guess you both sort of implied there a little bit. So I want to touch on the implications of war. Anand, you had mentioned the correlation, and I don't know if the zippers are going to have the one more dependency overall on polyester. But here, you have war going on. War is impacting oil, and polyester is probably going to have dependency on oil. So maybe try to connect the dots there. Okay, my critical component is zipper, but zipper is going to have many different dependencies there, obviously in the polyester market. So how that is going to be impacted overall? Ben, do you want to start first? The implications of war.
Sure. So the implications of war, there's both when a war happens, which we're certainly seeing in Eastern Europe right now, and with those different groups that are involved in it. So we're seeing things that are natural gas related primarily in this area that then ends up sending demand shock through the system in certain regions, and Europe is one of the hardest hit. However, what we are seeing is like for instance with India, where they're actually pulling in lower cost petroleums, as is China today. And so both being very opportunistic in this area, where it's funny how kind of the whack-a-mole or the shift ends up happening in these areas where suddenly we start to see that flowing in a different way than we might have before in the past. But then there's also the threat of war. And so in the areas when conflicts and or tensions start to rise, we start to see businesses that really start to look at it and say, like where will we find stability, right? Where can we know that we can have a stable supply chain, and that the calculus starts to switch? It starts to switch again away from potentially the lowest cost to a place to where we say, okay, we actually want to make sure that we have sustained supply. So I think that for many of your listeners, if they've been, in the market for the past 4 years, one of the things that really stung was the lost sales. And it wasn't just the lost revenues from the lost sales. It actually was because they actually may have given up some of their market share to other groups that didn't go out of supply. And so that's not necessarily something that you can get back easily. And again, we don't have to belabor that. But again, conflicts of multiple different sorts, whether that be trade, economic, and or physical in nature, and of course, all of them are tragic in certain ways. Like that all has to go into people's equation as they think about it. Specifically, though, I think that this is something that we're going to begin seeing more and more organizations that are making switches because of that, trying to find safe harbors or from groups that have like the depth and the width of manufacturing capability in order to produce all of these. And the interesting part is that in the short term, you're going to see some opportunities in places like India. And obviously we'd be happy to talk with your listeners more if that's something that they're interested in. But there's actually a lot of different places where this is happening. And I would say that like when you think about this, it's not just the oil price, so to speak. It's also the energy price. And so even if you have cheap coal or you have cheap oil, that doesn't necessarily mean that your energy price that goes to the manufacturers is inexpensive. And this is actually an area that when we look at like the southeast of the US or even the Texas region, they have a lot of competitive advantage, like globally. And so for your listeners, they may actually find some surprises there as well to the positive. But again, for groups like India, this is an area that's going to be critical for them. Not only do they need to remain in supply while war is going on, but then on top of that, to then say, okay, how do we make sure that we've got the infrastructure in place and the policies, you mentioned taxation as one of those, that really then allows for the raw materials to be produced at a price that's competitive as they continue to grow as a market.
Okay, amazing. Anand, do you have anything to add there?
Absolutely. I'd just like to add that for India, most people must be aware of our leadership. Our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's been in power for the last 8 years, has been stressing on his Make in India campaign since he joined office, which basically puts the focus on Indian manufacturing. It gives a push. It makes it easier for manufacturers to do business in terms of to conduct business. When you talk about taxation, on exports, there is multiple different types of subsidies that the government has proposed for all different types of industries related to exports. There is no GST implied on any kind of exports that you do from the country. And apart from that, there are multiple different types of drawbacks that a factory can draw from the government. As their exports from the country increase. And this has been a major push for factories in India. People have been, setting up multiple different types of factories for, particularly in export promotion zones in India, where import of any materials is also duty free. So basically, there has been a ton of push from the government of India to make sure that exports rise. And like Benjamin said, the opportunity to source coal from different countries during this war that's taken place has ensured that India has enough supplies in terms of its power power generating capabilities. But I also wanted to add that more than the current war that's going on, I think some of the other things that we should consider here is also the US and China trade war that has been going on for the past few years. That has also shifted focus towards Indian manufacturers because the duties on multiple different types of product categories for imports from India are significantly lower than that of certain other countries in Southeast. So there's always a balancing act here. Like there's one war that causes a lot of damage, while the other war sort of gives you opportunities to sort of develop your own country's strengths.
Okay, Sam, I think there's one other key thing here that we haven't touched on, and it's something that we see as a successful strategy for organizations, especially on the India side when we talk about policy, is that not only thinking about India as an export for you as an organization, but also looking at it for the domestic market itself, the domestic Indian market. And so, especially when we look at like a difference between like an East Asia, China, or VAT refunds or these types of things versus some of the drawbacks that Anantveer mentioned, is that part of it is for export. Okay, so if they're exporting, there are certain policies that have gone into place. But then also, if it's a mix between export as well as sale into the domestic market, you can actually significantly grow your business potentially, as well as achieve lower costs. And so that's something to think through. I find that oftentimes, depending on where groups are from, my European friends, I think because of the size of their markets, oftentimes are looking at like, how do we expand to the next market? Whereas some of my North American friends, it's kind of like, our market's big enough to where we don't always think about moving to the next market. But these are huge opportunities that if you find the right manufacturing partner, and if you find the right group that can then retail or resell your product, you can have significant growth in a short time.
Okay, some very interesting layers here. So now I want to take your perspective overall from the marketplace business model. And we have had a lot of different debates and discussions. And right now, in my mind, it's still in very how this is going to go overall, how the manufacturers are going to be receiving it, as I don't know if this is going to be more of the for them. So when I talk to my manufacturing friends, there are two perspectives. One perspective is always, okay, this is going to be my additional channel, more from revenue perspective, also from the vendor's perspective, that I am trying to tap into the vendor groups or the country where I never had access to. Here I have sense of reliability, because you guys are probably going to be vetting those vendors a lot more than a manufacturer can. The other perspective is more of the revenue, that you are looking at more from the supplier perspective, that this is your additional revenue channel. But there is a third perspective, and these guys see marketplaces as more of the technology company who's perceived as more of the brokers. They are trying to make commission, so they are no. Why am I doing my rev share with these guys? So these are some of the different mindsets in the market. Obviously, every business is going to add significant value to the value chain. So in your perspective, where is this whole marketplace business model headed? Where do you see it going, let's say, next 3, 5, 10 years?
Yeah. So when we look at marketplace, especially in the product development sphere, it's interesting because there's not as many organizations that are out there. You can find marketplaces that are focused on, say, design, product design, get it designed, or something along those lines. You can find other groups that are focused on supply chain, but it's very difficult to find ones that where you say, how do we bring a multi-party group together that you can have a successful product development journey? And that really is the core basis for us at Gemba, which is that how do you bring the designers all the way to the manufacturers? And there's different parts of that. How do you select the right designer? How do you find that person who is in your space, who really understands and can get you quickly there? Sometimes the advice of an expert, 15 minutes with them is worth weeks of time with an amateur, for those of you who have been in business in the past. And then for the manufacturing side, really when you're at an inflection point, if there's a lot of transparency in the marketplace already, and by that I just mean like finding different options, like sure, like it's relatively easy. You can just pick up the phone and you can call or you can email or do those things. But when you have a developing market, when you have changes, right, change that's going on, these are opportunities where having boots on the ground, having people that are actually getting on buses, getting on trains, traveling to the location to actually be in the manufacturing space is really so critical. And then on the manufacturing side, it's about how do we build volume? How do we build good business? And if we have great quality, how do we project that? And so I believe that by bringing these pieces together, that it'll allow small to medium-sized organizations, as well as big business that may be smaller or medium-sized divisions, to really navigate the waters well. Because I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, my expectation is that we're going to see more turbulence. We're not going to be seeing less turbulence. And so for people that were on the airplane and they saw their drink kind of shaking and they kind of grabbed the thing and they're like, when is this going to stop? I would just say, on this one, this is going to be the new normal for a period of time. There's going to be great opportunity. We're going to see brands that grow really, really fast in this, and they're going to have to be really agile. And that's where marketplaces come in. That's where if you can be using your resources, you can stay small, you can stay agile as an organization, you can bring in significant profits by partnering with different marketplaces that allow you to do that. But Anantveer, especially, as you look at India specifically, what are you seeing in the marketplace side of it, and where are the opportunities?
So the opportunities, Ben, in India are pretty much in the vendor space in India. I think the vendor market, the factory market in India is I would say really untapped. I think the visibility that many of these exporters have is really something to take a look at. I think with more visibility into their infrastructure, with more visibility into their um, you know into their interest in developing a new clientele and a new market is something that we need to focus on, and something that we are wanting to sort of focus on going into the future.
Well, as a quick note, Sam, just as we finish up, we're also seeing a lot in the India side in terms of with engineering. So for organizations, and I know software engineering is something that people oftentimes go to, but we're talking about like physical goods engineering, DFM, these types of things where people are doing finite element analysis and these types of things. There's some really good organizations. And so again, this is where we had one client who said, it's like hiring PhDs, except for a much lower cost. And so in so much as that's helpful for you as an organization, I think you still have to look at how do you establish quality? How do you make sure that they're a good business, that they follow through? That's where the marketplace reputation models really come into effect. But then ultimately it allows you to be agile so that you can be working with some of the best people at the best prices for the best results.
All right, guys. So that's it for today. Do you guys have any last minute closing advice for our listeners? Ben, do you want to start first?
Sure. I would just say, again, as I mentioned, I think that the turbulence is actually going to grow significantly greater over time. We may go into a period where it seems like things are settling out a little bit, but overall, we really see a trend of transition that's happening. You need to know your market, like not just like go with the crowd, right? Like everybody's like, okay, we all need to leave this. That's not what you should do. You should understand what the strengths of each market are. And then you need to be looking about 2 to 5 years ahead on where is it moving? Where is the hockey puck moving there? Because that will allow you to start making the bridging opportunities that you need to in order to be at the right place at the right time so that you don't get caught out. Again, there's many groups and teams that I know that your listeners can team up with. But again, be prepared for more turbulence and not less.
Okay, Anna, do you have any closing advice, please?
Yes, I just have one small advice. So anyone out there who's looking to develop a new product from scratch and wants to consider a new market, has their vision in place, I would only suggest to try and be a little more patient and consider that any new product development takes a little bit of time and understanding between the two parties involved. And that time, I would say, is critical to develop trust, to develop a sense of long-term successful business partnership opportunity. And I think a good 5 to 6 months is an average period of time. I'm not saying that that's how long it takes. In certain cases, we've developed products within 2 months, but it completely boils down to what product you're talking about. On the average, I would say if you consider around 5 to 6 months of product development time with your chosen manufacturer and really hone that partnership, I think that is going to go a long way in setting up your supply chain.
All right, guys, and my personal takeaway from this conversation is going to be, as much as I don't want any more turbulence in my life or in this world, there is going to be turbulence, so you definitely need to plan for that. And that's what is going to make your supply chain robust. On that note, I really want to thank you guys for your time and insights today. This has been a powerful episode.
Thank you so much, Sam.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Anant or Ben, head over to Gembah.com. It's GEMBAH.com. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with David Chavez, who shares the nuances of outsourced contract manufacturing. Also, the interview with Rick Watson, who shares how to plan for warehouse and logistics architecture for DTC brands selling through marketplaces. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.